Welcome to my yard. I'm Donna Quesada, and I'm presenting today a presentation about the ills of meat eating, and I call it the triple tragedy of meat eating. And I'm drawing from sources, a synthesis of sources that I've used through the year in my own classes at Santa Monica College in dealing with these issues and educating on these issues in various ways. For example, the philosophy of Peter Singer has been very influential to me. I will be drawing on his principle of equal consideration of interests, as well as the compassionate work of John Robbins. I'll be using statistics from the United Nations, and I'll be mentioning renegades and revolutionaries Howard Lyman, who's an inspiration to me, and Dr. Colin Campbell, as well as little tidbits of Eastern philosophy. The topic of vegetarian eating, which is what this is really about, is still not mainstream, but it's going in that direction, and it's exciting to me to see it move that way, because when I first started talking about these things more than 10 years ago, maybe somewhere in the area of 13 years ago, they were still unheard of. It was still weird. But today, I think almost everyone has a vegetarian friend or a vegetarian family member, and you see vegetarian or vegan restaurants pretty much all over, at least here in LA, and you see vegetarian items on restaurant menus, and so that's an exciting thing. But yet, it's still a difficult thing to talk about. Why is that? It seems to be a difficult thing to talk about because you are urging people, when you talk about it, to reflect on their eating habits, their food choices, and their eating habits are personal and intimate and private and special and connected up with comfort, with family memories, with traditions. And so it's easier not to reflect on those things. It's easier to put up a wall. And so you see very often people's defense mechanisms being triggered by any discussion of vegetarianism. And I think the most common defense mechanism is that of ignorance, in the simplest sense of the word, which is to ignore. It's easier to ignore it and to be unaware of these issues, and thus to make a change in order to improve the environment and our own health and the welfare of animals. And that's why I've named this presentation the triple tragedy of meat eating, because its effects concern our own health, but also the environment and its health and the welfare of animals. I see myself as disseminating seeds. I don't know where they'll land. I don't know if they'll take root, where they'll take root, but I feel like these issues are important enough for me to put my thoughts about it and the culmination of work that I've done through the years on it onto tape, and see where the seeds land, if they do land. And once that's done, people with more clout can take up the issues. People like one of my heroes, Paul McCartney. Just last month I picked up the LA Weekly, which is one of the most popular free readers here in Los Angeles, and I saw a terrific interview by Paul McCartney. And she asked him, the interviewer asked him, what aspect of the future, as you envision it, do you find the most disturbing? And Paul McCartney said, it's not a good idea to look for disturbances. They come anyway, so don't invite them. He said, a big subject of mine is a report recently completed by the UN called Livestock's Long Shadow, which makes the point that the most important thing people could do for the future of the planet would be to eat vegetarian. He continues, cattle rearing is one of the most destructive human activities on Earth, and at this point, it's taking a bigger toll on the planet than airplanes and cars. And that's from the January 14th edition of LA Weekly. And I was so happy to see people, well, of course he's been talking about these things for years, but to see it now making its way into publications like LA Weekly tells me that we're going to start looking at the issue. And it's so important that of course I'm happy to see it making its way into the mainstream. And you have Ellen DeGeneres now, who's outed in more ways than one. She and her partner have have declared that they are maintaining a vegetarian diet now. For these reasons, the environmental destruction associated with it, but also because they love animals and they just can't see themselves contributing to such a harmful industry that does so much, well, commits so much torture to animals. And so the pictures of their vegetarian wedding ceremony were featured in, what was it, In Style magazine. In terms of the environment, so much forest and so much grain land and water are wasted, and the water that remains is polluted because of it. For example, and I'm quoting Scientific American, the typical North American diet, with its large share of animal products, requires twice as much water to produce as the less meat-intensive diets common in many Asian and some European countries. Eating lower on the food chain could allow the same volume of water to feed 2 Americans instead of 1, with no loss in nutrition. And that's from an article called Growing More Food with Less Water, written by Sandra Postel in 2001. Eating meat is just an all-around consumptive, wasteful process in terms of the grain used, the water used, and the land used. John Robbins, who, as I mentioned before, is one of my heroes and has done so much wonderful work in this area, explains, not only in his book but in the video component of his best-selling Diet for a New America, that the process of converting grain to meat is an entirely inefficient system, which devours most of the grain grown in this country, as well as, unfortunately, others that we've quote-unquote utilized in order to support our meat-based diet. And now I'm quoting Robbins. We feed these animals over 80% of the corn we grow, 95% of the oats. The livestock population of the U.S. consumes enough grain and soybeans to feed over 5 times the entire human population of the country. You know, sometimes we hear these statistics and numbers can be so overwhelming that it goes in one ear and out the other, but I always say to my students, whoa, just stop and pause on that for a moment. It's overwhelming, mind-boggling. 95% of the oats, and oats, as we're seldom told, are full of protein. This is a almost perfect food to eat, and we could be eating it directly, but we're giving it to the livestock. And when we give the grain to the livestock, most of the usable energy is lost. In fact, only 10% of the calories become usable, as opposed to direct consumption of the grain. So much is wasted. And that's why so much land is needed to support this diet.